Hello, as promised, here's the video on what's wrong with the media and why are we not getting the truth. Many of you know I had a personal tragedy in Colombia, South America that led me on a wild political and fact-finding ride that continues to this day. The experiences that I had through an injustice in South America led me on a 21-day walk across 3 states to get to the United States Embassy in Bogota for help. And I finally reached the embassy, and the embassy would not help me. And they actually worked against me, and I would have perished. I would have actually died had it not been for the Colombian National Police that guard the most outer perimeter of the United States Embassy. I spent approximately 2 weeks outside of the embassy with no food, money, or anything during Thanksgiving week and a little beyond of 2010. I watched Marines enter and exit and Department of State personnel enter and exit daily. They all knew my plight and let me suffer so on the streets outside of the embassy, with not so much as offering me a cup of water. I watched meals be catered in on Thanksgiving Day, and I was hungry on the streets Thanksgiving Day. So I developed a disdain for the bureaucracy, obviously, and some months later I returned to the United States. This story broke all across Colombia and throughout other nations in South America, but I desperately wanted everyone in the United States to know. So upon my return, I contacted several local television stations in my home state of North Carolina, and one station actually admitted to me what the problem was. To my surprise, the gentleman at this particular station told me that they wanted to run the story, but unfortunately, if they did run the story, that the Department of State would not give them news from overseas. He proceeded to tell me how much of a tragedy this story was, and that the American public needed to know, but that if he ran the story, that not being able to get this overseas news would be harmful to others. And it was mentioned to me, I knew that North Carolina has a large military presence, and we have Marine camps and Fort Bragg and whatnot, and that if we had problems with service members overseas, that the stations would not be able to break the news and would not be able to get information for North Carolina family members. This actually just added more fuel to my fire. So I've always been on the lookout for why, and I've done a lot of research, and everything comes back to a couple of groups and some individuals. And As I always state in these videos, do not take what I tell you and etch it in stone. Verify for yourself. So if you go to your local library or online or at your local bookstore or on Amazon or what have you, look up books concerning the CFR, the Council of Foreign Relations. The CFR, as I got to digging, and oddly enough, a quick story of why I got to digging on the Council on Foreign Relations, the CFR, was because Bob Beckel, a famous political analyst and Democratic strategist, said on a news program that Obama needed to focus on foreign affairs and stay off of the domestic issues. And when the other person on the show had asked him why, he let the American people know a reality. He said that the president could control the State Department somewhat, and in so doing could control global news, and that they could have the Department of State, the White House could have the Department of State spin these stories in ways to make the president look good. And that pointed me in the direction of the CFR. I also looked at the Trilateral Commission, and you can easily find that online. There are many books written on the CFR and the Trilateral Commission. I want to start by talking to you very briefly about a gentleman named Oscar Callaway. And Mr. Callaway actually gave some evidence and statements that went on congressional record that really gets to the heart of the matter of what's wrong with the media in the United States and possibly the media throughout most of the world. So I want to talk about that. Mr. Callaway stated that J.P. Morgan hired 12 of the best newsmen of the day that he could find. And keep in mind, this was before the advent of radio. So we basically had news magazines and newspapers, and obviously no television. He hired these 12 newsmen, and they had one goal in mind: how could Mr. Morgan control the news? And they created this small think tank, and they came up with an excellent idea. They said, they told Mr. Morgan if he could get 25 of the best papers within the United States, that he could control the news in the United States. Now that may sound far-fetched, but something was going on then that is going on now in a little bit of a different way, but same process, and I will explain that to you. Let's take the Charlotte Observer, for example. Most people know of Charlotte, North Carolina, and know that it's a good-sized city, but the Charlotte Observer does not send reporters all over the world. They get stories from other newspapers. They may get a story from the New York Times or the Washington Post, and they're all intermingling and getting stories from one another. And back then they were openly plagiarizing one another. So if I worked for the Charlotte Observer in 1905, I may read something out of the New York Times and plagiarize it. and printed in the Charlotte paper. And that was very prevalent some years ago. A lot of that has stopped because there's more ways to enter check, and unfortunately they're not conducting investigative journalism as well as they're checking on each other. So still to this day you may have UPI and the Associated Press, and stories will come out and on the news wire, and these writers will write about these things. So every news source does not have people all over the globe getting the news. They're relying on other people, and that's where the danger comes in. But at any rate, these 12 men told him, if you can get these 25 of the best papers, you can basically control the mood of the news, the opinions of the day, and so on and so forth. Great control, more control than Washington, D.C. by a long shot, as we will come to see. Then entered a man named Mr. Warburg. I don't have his first name in front of me, but there again, do not etch what I tell you in stone. Go verify, and voila, you can get his name. And the Rockefellers got together. So they had a little group, and from that little group was slowly created the Council on Foreign Relations. And a very, very dangerous group. We'll get into in a minute some of the people who belong to the group, but I want to discuss a few of the crazy things that have come from folks in this group. First, one of the major lies perpetrated on the American public was in the 1930s, and it was concerning the Soviet Union. Here we go, we're going to the extreme left and communism here. In the 1930s, there was a gentleman that worked for the New York Times named Walter Duranty. And Mr. Duranty was the leading news writer on issues with the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. And what was going on in the Ukraine was that the Soviets were deporting Ukrainians, and in these deportations 1 million Ukrainians died. Murders, rapes, starvations, all these bad, terrible, terrible things. And Mr. Duranty said that it was all fictitious and downplayed this to the point that, to me, it was criminal. We moved forward a couple of years, and we're still in the 30s, and Joseph Stalin instituted a policy to build up his military, and one of the ways to pay for it was, there again, he moves troops into the Ukraine, and he takes all of their grain stock. I mean, basically all of it. And there are estimates that 7 million Ukrainians died of starvation during this time. And Mr. Duranty actually wrote that that was a myth. And we know now that it was the truth. And we know through documentation that Mr. Duranty knew and understood full well that this was actually happening. But because of him, the American public was unaware. I'm not saying that we could have stopped it, but at least we would have known, and at least we could have villainized Joseph Stalin enough that after World War II to not have let him take over all of Eastern Europe. A huge, huge travesty. We have other issues. We have Chinagate. Most of you have no idea what Chinagate is. Well, but you do know who Monica Lewinsky is, and you know about Kenneth Starr and all this with President Clinton. Folks, dozens of people went to prison, and many people fled the country. And what happened was, excuse me, secrets were being sold to China, and not just any secrets, military technology secrets. And in exchange, money was being funneled into Bill Clinton's campaign. The press purposely controlled that story and focused in on the president having sexual relations with this young aide, and that couldn't have been twisted and bent in a better way. If that would not have happened and the press were actually conducting investigative journalism concerning Chinagate, more than likely we would have a former president of the United States, sitting in a federal prison today, as much of the evidence points to that he should be. Another, probably the biggest for us, the Tet Offensive. And the Tet Offensive was the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese conducting a huge military operation all over South Vietnam. The facts are that that was a huge victory for the United States and for South Vietnam. We almost decimated the communists. That was a total failure for them, and the former foreign minister for North Vietnam actually admitted the truth with aspects to this when he said the America's own press sabotaged America and broke the will of the American people through propaganda lies. And most people that know history or are old enough to remember can remember Walter Cronkite getting on the air and saying, this reporter's saying that we can't win this war, and basically we need to stop, it's all futile. And Walter Cronkite was not a reporter. He had long since not been a reporter, and he sure as hell was not a investigative journalist. He was an anchorman dictating what the news would be to Americans. And this is what happens when you get people in that small group and they take the news off of one another. In that business, it's follow the lead. And when someone comes up and gives the lead, if there's no investigative journalism behind that lead, we see what happens. And unfortunately, these stories are not being thoroughly checked. I'm not a Lyndon Johnson fan, but shortly after leaving office, President Johnson gave a good, thorough interview concerning that and let the American public know that it was a farce, and basically letting us know what had happened and that it was wrong, and it was wrong. Sometimes I get called an isolationist, and I certainly don't think that we needed to be in Vietnam. But that aside, we did not need a press over here sabotaging military troops in Vietnam and breaking the will and the spirit of the American people, which is occurring today. Our will and spirit is being broken because we are getting wrong news, and this news is being controlled by the CFR, the Trilateral Commission, and the Department of State, and other interests such as AIPAC. AIPAC is a foreign lobby, and it's the biggest lobby in the United States of America, and it is a foreign lobby. So we've got to wake up and smell the coffee and start digging and looking. In 1991, David Rockefeller gave a speech to the CFR, and as I said, the Rockefellers and the Morgans, and oddly enough, in the election process in 91, or maybe the debates were in 92, no, they would have been in 91, no one questioned Clinton nor the first President Bush that they both were members of the CFR and the Trilateral Commission. No one brought this up. And if you look at their presidencies, once you get past Republican or Democratic propaganda, you start to see that basically one presidency was a continuation of the other, with very minor differences and philosophies. So, but Barbara Walters is a member of that, the CFR, Dan Rather. Interestingly enough, Michael Eisner was head of the Walt Disney Corporation and Disney Films, and they merged with ABC, and right after that merger they both joined. Rupert Murdoch is a member. All of the big media moguls are members of the CFR. Now, what in the world would the news need to be members of the Council on Foreign Relations or the Trilateral Commission? They should be independent of these organizations. I want to talk to you about one other story about the Serbian Christians. Back in 1990, a story came out that was totally fictitious, and there was another Pulitzer Prize winner, Roy Gutman, that helped put out this false propaganda. And the Serbian Christians were being villainized that they were committing genocide against other groups in 1990, and I do believe that spawned a few years later, aggravated the situation way out of control, and I believe there was a reason behind that, and I believe it was to cause war, and I don't think it worked out the way the powers to be that may have wanted war, but I can't see of any other reason why they did this. But what happened was they concocted a story that the Christian Serbs were massacring and committing genocide on Muslims in the area, and they got this man that looked like he was about to starve to death. He actually was reminiscent of the pictures that one would see of Holocaust survivors that had their ribs showing and were near death due to starvation. Well, it turns out that through just a little bit of investigative journalism that this gentleman was born that way with a birth defect, so he always looked that way. And if that was not enough, journalists over there constructed a fence around them, around themselves as journalists, and took videos and videotaped the people on the other side of the fence and said that they were being held against their will, making it look as if these people were starving to death and herded up in fenced in locations, and they were not fenced in anywhere. They were free to go anywhere that they wanted to go. And this gentleman that looked as if he had been starved to death in the freezing cold was asked to take his shirt off, and he did, and they put that photograph on the cover of Time magazine. So we have been flim-flammed, and we see later on we dropped bombs in the area, and things heated up and did get worse, and there were many killings, and I believe that this story aggravated and brought on a lot of what was to come in Serbia a few short years later. And then of course we bombed and all of that, and many people killed, more anarchy, just a lot of trouble. I don't have time to go into the historical aspects of that situation, but this is factual, what I'm telling you, and you can verify it. Now I want to read what David Rockefeller said to the CFR in 1991. And he said, "We are grateful to the Washington Post, New York Times, Time Magazine, and other publications, whose directors have attended our meetings and have respected their promises of discretion for almost 40 years. It would have been impossible for us to develop our plan for the world if we had been subject to the bright lights of publicity. But the world is now more sophisticated and prepared to march toward a world government." So this was secretly recorded, and it was taken out of the CFR meeting and released to the public, and the sad fact is that most of us have no idea about this. So as usual, I'm asking you to do your own research. I could go on with examples of how we're flim-flammed and the injustices that have been perpetrated by our own press. I believe that along with the First Amendment is the right to information. And the reason why I say this is, how important is the First Amendment if information that can come out from us is programmed into us? So I would take that and think about that. The First Amendment is kind of meaningless if all we know to say has been programmed into us. So I believe that in actuality, we're looking at a First Amendment breakdown here of sorts. But at any rate, we just simply can't continue to allow this to happen. This has repeatedly been turned into a conservative liberal issue. It's been turned into a Democrat Republican issue with mild minor differences. And when the big things come and the bad things happen, we have no idea. And that's why I've been putting out some history videos and put out a few videos on World War II to let you see what we're being lied to about in our schools and what the media is lying to us about every time we watch a program on history concerning World War II and the stark causes to that. We got to the bottom of Winston Churchill and so many things that we've been misled and lied to about. So I would like to ask everyone, look into information on the CFR, the Trilateral Commission, and honesty in U.S. media, and how that all ties in, and you'll get a picture. I used to, some years ago, I would hear people talk about, oh, the Morgans and the Rockefellers and these other people, and these people are conspiring against us. And I thought, well, these people are nuts. They might as well have 10 full hats on. But all one has to do is just look. The information is there. The documented evidence is there. Verbal comments are there in audio and video. And when one looks, one can find the truth quite easily. And remember that just as food, the ingesting of food and good foods keeps us healthy, and ingesting bad foods make us sick, the same can be applied to information and news. If we are ingesting bad information and bad news, it brings upon a cancerous effect. And I firmly believe, just through factual history, that for at least 100 years in the United States, this misnews information and propaganda has brought an ever-growing cancer upon the United States. So please watch and verify the news and the information that you ingest. God bless you. If you're watching this video on YouTube, please hit the subscribe button to this channel. And thank you so much for watching this video. Stay informed.